unfortunately, this argument has taken legs to the point where we are now having arguments or consensus around Black people not only being from Africa and coming to the Americas pre-Columbus, but there's an argument that's emerging that we are the actual Native Americans, okay, indigenous people, yeah, in the United States and the Americas as a whole. Not only is this emerging, but this argument is also grounded in historical erasure. And so we have individuals who are actual Native Americans, American Indians, Aboriginals, however you want to call them, or however they call themselves, being isolated and being erased from history because of these arguments that we're seeing online. And in fact, one of the reasons why we're bringing you, as well as Khan, to this platform is because they're using your words as a way to justify these particular arguments. And so we want to get the record straight for two reasons. Number one, we want to protect our ancestors. We want to protect the history that is grounded in our foundation as African Americans in this country. And furthermore, we want to set the record straight about the transatlantic slave trade, because again, there are people out here denying the fact that it even happened to begin with. And again, using your words to back it up. And so we're just going to cut to the chase here with the first question. And if you could, and I know this might sound very elementary, very strange, I'm even asking this question, but to both of you, who are the Native Americans, Indigenous Americans, American Indians, however you want to coin the term for those individuals? Who are they in the Americas? So in other words, when we say Native Americans, when you all say Native Americans or Indigenous Americans or Aboriginal, who are you talking about? Who are these individuals and how did they migrate to America?
So should I go first, Hafiz?
Sure. Yeah, I think so.
Well, there's a grain of truth to this position in the sense that we're actually all descended from Black people. Mm-hmm. And obviously arrived in the Americas at different times. But there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that Africans arrived before 1492. We've spent many years, obviously, associated not only with the transatlantic slave trade database, but with a lot of scholarship before then. And from my perspective, I don't think it's been established at all that we had clear contacts between Africa and the Americas prior to 1492. That being said, go back to my first point, we're all descended from Black people. It's I think broadly accepted that Homo sapiens left Africa first and spread to the rest of the world. And the point here is that they didn't reach the Americas until, well, there's different arguments about it, but you can say probably 20 or 30,000 years ago. So, yeah, I'm yet to be persuaded that there's been any contact at all prior to 1492. Mm-hmm. Nafis, do you?
Yeah, no, I would echo the same thing, and I think part of that, timing of, when you speak with different indigenous communities from the Americas, they oftentimes use the language of time immemorial. That's the word, the phrase they often use when describing, their histories, their stories. It's from time immemorial, right? So if the exact dating of when people emerged out of Africa, and Homo sapiens, as David mentioned, is it 20,000, 30,000 years ago? That part I think is we're looking for that record. But it's very clear that the different groups of people, they have their own identity, and very much so. It's not Africans in like 1000, CE or AD that were there prior to Columbus's contact with the Americans. There's just no evidence. So yeah, just echo.
Yeah, and I maybe just add that we've done a lot of research on this issue, and we cannot find evidence in the 15th century of actual transatlantic crossings. Okay, so people will perhaps argue it anyway without evidence, but for me, there isn't any such indication.
Okay. And when we talk about this, is just a side note, because again, I want to make sure that we clear up all kinds of misconceptions here. When we talk about Native Americans and American Indians, those terms are interchangeable, correct?
Yeah, pretty well. Yeah.
Okay.
And also, I think as one of those things with identity is, the community that makes up, how they want to be referred to or how they call themselves, that terminology always continues to evolve, right? So you find, Native American kind of not going out of favor, but people referring to just Native or tribal communities or indigenous. And so I think there is a strong kind of sense of wanting to be identified themselves. They identify themselves. So not wanting to be, minimal or limiting in how people choose to identify themselves.
Yeah. And even with the arguments here, and I'm sure you see the book in front of you from Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, one of the arguments that he typically used in this book was the idea of the gold-tipped spears that apparently had been found. He said it was from Christopher Columbus, but of course we know from further research and understanding that this actually were the words of, these were actually the words of Bartholomew de las Casas, right? Mm-hmm. Finding those gold-tipped spears and finding these people who he said were not unlike the Ethiopians, referring to Africans. Mm-hmm. How do we interpret that? How do we interpret that based on the time period of when Columbus and Bartholomew de las Casas and the other Spaniards and Portuguese individuals were coming to colonize this side of the world?
Well, yeah, I don't find the arguments in the book persuasive.
Yeah.
We spent so much time in the archives, including the earliest Portuguese archives of the earliest Portuguese voyages, and there's just no evidence. I mean, I'm not sure what else I can say.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we want to show you some clips just from some of the prior interviews that you've done with others. You did a really strong interview with Lipton Matthews, which we enjoyed watching. There's been a clip though from Lipton Matthews that we want to show you that we found on YouTube that's been circling around on social media. And so in this interview with Lipton Matthews, you mentioned something about Native Africans. And so we want to play that for you real quick and then get your feedback on what you meant when you were talking about this.
Those people did not come from Africa. They came as a result of natural population growth.
Yeah.
The slave trade to the US was shut down largely in 1807, not completely, but largely. So if you look at the census data for the US in 1870, which is when Black people were finally included, you'll find almost no Africans. They were, of course, Native African Americans. And that's not something that people have taken on board.
So after hearing this, and again, there's a lot of stuff circling around on social media, particularly TikTok and other platforms that are suggesting that, again, going back to our initial conversation about indigenous peoples, that you were talking about them. I want to make sure that we all get some clarity on this. When you said Native Africans and Native African Americans, who were you referring to?
Well, Native Africans are people born in Africa. That's a very simple, clear definition. Mm-hmm. African Americans clearly were not born in Africa. Well, for the most part anyway, in the US, right? So I'm not sure I can expand further on that.
Yeah. And so just for basic understanding and clarity here, when you're saying Native African Americans, because you mentioned population growth, and this is going to go to a certain question here that one of my other guests are going to ask, or interviewers are going to ask. When you're saying Native African Americans, who are these Native African Americans? Where are they coming from? We know that they're born in America, but are they the offspring of Africans? Who are they?
Well, yes, obviously they have offspring from people who came from Africa. No question about that. But essentially that contact with Africa was severed with the Abolition Act, as I think the 1870 census information confirms.
And just to add one thing about that is, I think some of the work of, whether or not people were coming from the Caribbean that can explain kind of this growth, even though the trade directly from Africa to the U.S. was, as David said, more or less severed following 1808. That growth, the number of people coming from the Caribbean doesn't explain fully a growth of over 3.5 million people in the next 40 or 50 years, right? So that's where that domestic population growth, those are kind of very seemingly benign terms, but those really, reference the exploitative nature of plantation slavery in the U.S. and that growth, right? That population growth, separating of families and the exploitation, in particular, of Black women during that time. That more readily explains this kind of large growth in the population in the U.S., right? We're allowing U.S. to become the largest slave society, right, at the start of the Civil War, by far, right? Larger than Brazil, even though Brazil imported a factor of 10, more people directly from Africa. The U.S. would become the largest slave society that we've seen.
And just to add to that, and to anticipate a related question that I think you had in the list, we think about 15% of the Africans that arrived in the Americas actually came via the Caribbean. And that's over a period of probably close to 2 centuries.
And that speaks to the I'm assuming you're talking about the intra-American slavery.
Which is very important and has been misunderstood for many years, but I think now it's becoming clear how important it was. In both directions. It wasn't just to the US, it was from the Caribbean to Spanish America.